Imagine it is the year 355. The sun sets at 3 in the afternoon, casting long skeletal shadows across the frost-bitten fields of England. You are standing in a small village, the air so cold that every breath you take feels like inhaling shards of glass. There is no central heating, no humming electricity, no insulate walls to shield you from the howling wind. Outside, a blizzard is brewing, a white swirling beast that threats to bury your home in snow and silence. You are a peasant. Your survival for the next 4 months depends entirely on a few piles of dried wood, a thick wool tunic, and the warmth of the animals sharing your living space. How did your ancestors, ordinary people like you and me, survive when nature turned its coldest face toward them? Why did they not perish under the weight of the endless winter? Today, we peel back the layers of time to uncover the intimate, often overlooked strategies of medieval survival. We are not just talking about wood and fire, we are talking about human ingenuity, the strength of the community, and the profound, silent resilience that allowed civilization to persist through the Little Ice Age. This is a journey into the heart of the medieval winter, a world of darkness, mystery, and credible endurance. As we traverse this frozen landscape, we will discover how architectural genius was hidden in wattle and daub walls, how the rhythm of the seasons dictated every human pulse, and how the simple act of huddling together was the ultimate safeguard against the void. Welcome to a history that breathes with the cold, a narrative woven from the frost itself. The channel Sleepy History with Kevin is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. If you were to step inside a typical peasant cottage in 4th century England, the first thing that would strike you is not the cold but the smell, a mix of wood smoke, damp earth, and the grounding scent of livestock. You might find the architecture primitive by modern standards, yet it was a masterclass in survival engineering. These homes were not built for comfort in the way we define it today. They were built as a buffer between humanity and the indifference of the elements. The walls were typically constructed of wattle and daub, a woven lattice of wooden strips called wattle, daubed with a sticky mixture of wet soil, hay, sand, and straw. When this dried, it created a surprisingly effective thermal barrier. It wasn't just a wall, it was a living seal that kept the biting draughts at bay. The roof, thatched with thick layers of dried reeds or straw, served as a heavy woolen coat for the building, trapping the rising heat within. But the true hero of this structure was the central hearth. Located in the middle of the main room, it was the beating heart of the household. There were no chimneys. Smoke escaped through the gaps in the thatch, which in itself served a purpose. The soot helped to seal the roof further, making it even more weather-resistant. Around this circle of fire, the hierarchy of the home was defined by proximity to the flames. During the peak of a blizzard, the entire family, often including calves or piglets, would gather here. The body heat of the animals, combined with the hearth, created a microclimate that allowed the inhabitants to survive temperatures that would otherwise be lethal. In the eyes of a medieval villager, the house was not an isolated fortress, it was a shared vessel of life. The walls held secrets of the land, reflecting the symbiotic relationship between the forest, the soil, and the people who worked them. They understood that to keep the flame alive was to keep the spirit of the family alive. As the blizzard howled outside, clawing at the thatched eaves, the house held its breath, anchoring those inside to the earth, waiting for the first thaw of spring. The fire was never allowed to die completely. It was banked with ash at night, a smouldering promise that the cold would not win today. While the stone and clay walls provided the shell of survival, it was the clothing that served as the individual's portable sanctuary. In the medieval era, you did not simply put on a coat to face the winter. You engaged in a ritual of layering that was as essential as breathing. The primary material of choice was, without question, wool. Sheep were the backbone of the English rural economy, not merely for trade, but for the very survival of the peasantry. Wool is a marvel of nature, even when damp, its insulating properties, a critical feature when living in a climate dominated by sleet, snow, and relentless humidity. The average villager wore a shift of linen next the skin, acting as a base layer, followed by a kirtle or tunic made of heavy felted wool. This wasn't refined soft wool of modern luxury. It was thick, coarse, and often saturated with natural lanolin, which acted as a mild water, repellent against the persistent dampness of the English winter. But the secret to their warmth lay in the science of trapped air. By wearing multiple layers, they created thin, insulating pockets between the fabric and their skin. This stagnant air prevented body heat from escaping into the freezing void of the outside world. Often, their feet were wrapped in thick woolen stockings, secured with leather thongs, or shoved into sturdy, wooden, soled clogs to keep them off the frost, heaving mud of the floor. It is easy to imagine these people as merely ragged or impoverished, but in truth, their clothing was a sophisticated response to their environment. Every stitch, every heavy fold of fabric represent a mastery of their limited resources. They understood that their survival depended on maintaining a stable internal temperature, no matter how low the mercury dropped. As they moved through the bitter wind, their clothes became a mobile cocoon, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest, coldest months, human innovation turned the bounty of the land into a shield against the frost. They moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, each layer serving as a silent sentinel, guarding against the creeping numbness of winter. When the storms turned the world into a monochromatic landscape of white and grey, the physical world shrank to the size of one's own village. Yet this physical confinement forced an emotional expansion. Medieval life was deeply communal, and nowhere was this more apparent than during the long, dark nights of deep winter. With the fields lying fallow and the livestock tucked safely inside, the villagers turned inward, not just toward their own hearths, but toward each other. In the small cottages, the flickering light of the fire did more than provide heat. It acted as a theatre for the human spirit. During these times, the social fabric tightened. Neighbours would gather in the house of the village elder or a wealthier farmer, bring whatever meagre fuel they could spare to keep a larger communal fire burning. This was a time for storytelling, for the passing down of sagas, local legends, and the wisdom of the elders. It was here, in the dim, smoky air, that the culture of the people was preserved. Music, too, became a survival mechanism. Simple melodies played on wooden flutes or sung in haunting, rhythmic chants to pass the time and sustain morale, when the psychological weight of the isolation began to press in. They shared not only warmth but also resources, a bit of dried meat, a handful of grain, or perhaps a warm cloak for someone who had lost theirs to the damp. This spirit of cooperation was not merely a virtue, it was the bedrock of survival. No individual could withstand the winter alone. The village was a single organism, and in the face of the blizzard, they leaned into one another. They understood that the cold was a thief, constant trying to steal their energy, their hope, and their health. By remaining united, by keeping the social flame alive alongside the physical one, they transformed their struggle from a solitary fight for existence into a collective journey through the dark. They found solace in the repetition of their chores, the routine of their prayers, and the constant, reassuring presence of their kin. It was a life defined by hard edges, yet softened by the profound endurance of the human heart, beating in synchrony against the unrelenting pressure of the ice. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Kevin, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes inspired by real events, figures and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or document cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. As the autumn leaves fell and the first frost turned the soil into iron, the medieval villagers' focus shifted from cultivation to the grim calculus of survival. The pantry was not a grocery store, it was a carefully managed treasury of potential life. Every ounce of food preserved in late summer was a direct investment against the hunger of the coming blizzard. The primary challenge was simple. How do you prevent decay when the world is wet and cold? Salting, smoking, and drying were the pillars of their survival. Meat, mostly pork, was salted heavily and hung in the rafters, where the rising smoke from the hearth acted as a natural preservative, infusing the flesh with a protective layer of soot and flavour. Vegetables like cabbages and turnips were stored in dark, cool cellars, or buried in pits lined with straw to prevent them from freezing solid and turning to mush. Grains, barley, oats, and wheat were the most vital treasures stored in dry, raised bins to keep them away from the damp ground and hungry pests. Even in these bleak conditions, the medieval diet was a testament to endurance. A staple meal might consist of a simple pottage, a thick, hearty stew made from whatever was on hand, a handful of grain, some dried peas, perhaps a sliver of cured bacon, and roots pulled from the cold earth. It was caloric, functional, and essential. They didn't have the luxury of variety, but they possessed a profound understanding of nutritional preservation. They lived by the calendar of the harvest, knowing that if the grain held out until the first green shoots of spring, they had won the battle against the winter. This deep connection to their food and the land that provided it is a reminder of how fragile, yet capable, human life truly is. If you find yours captivated by these stories of human perseverance and the hidden rhythms of the past, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue to reconstruct these lost chapters of history, bringing the voices of the past to life for a modern audience. Join our community as we delve deeper into the mysteries of the medieval world. Your engagement truly fuels our journey. The art of survival was not just about the food they ate, it was about the discipline they exercised. They lived with the constant awareness that abundance was fleeting and scarcity was a natural cycle. By managing their resource with such careful precision, they proved that even in the most unforgiving environments, humanity does not just survive, it finds a way to endure, plan, and ultimately prevail. In the modern world, the thought of sharing one's living space with farm animals is jarring. Yet, in the medieval English cottage, this cohabitation was not born of chaos or lack of hygiene, but of a sophisticated, if desperate, understanding of thermodynamics. When the snow banked high against the timber walls and the wind howled with a predatory intensity, the live cows, goats, or the prized family pig became the most valuable heating assets a peasant could possess. The animal was a living, breathing radiator. A single cow produces a surprise amount of body heat. By partitioning off a portion of the cottage, or in smaller dwellings, simply tethering the animals near the sleeping quarters, the family utilized the livestock's metabolic warmth to supplement the heat of the central hearth. This was a form of biogenic heating. The heat radiated from the animals would circulate through the room, raising the ambient temperature just enough to prevent the occupants from succumbing to the most severe effects of the hypothermic environment. This arrangement all served to protect the livestock, which were, after all, the family's primary capital. Losing a cow to the frosts meant more than the loss of an animal. It meant the loss of milk, fertilizer, and potential offspring, a catastrophic blow to a household's future. Thus the bond between the farmer and his beast became deeply intimate. The animal's rhythmic breathing and low, muffled chewing were the constant, grounding sounds of the long night. A steady hype that echoed the persistence of life itself amidst the frozen landscape. This practice also required a delicate balance of space and cleanliness. The animals were kept on a slightly raised area or on the opposite side of the room from the sleeping dais, separated by a low barrier. They were carefully tended to, their presence a source of comfort and security rather than mere utility. The air in the cottage might have been thick with the scent of hay, manure, and animal hide, but to the medieval inhabitant, this was the smell of safety. It was the scent of a stable, living, breathing system that kept the cold at bay. Every day the ritual remained the same, the morning feeding, the mucking of the small pen, the careful husbandry that ensured the animal remained healthy enough to endure the season. This shared struggle forged a unique bond. When the farmer looked into the eyes of his beast, he didn't see just an animal. He saw a partner in the struggle against the winter, a fellow traveller through the dark, cold months. As the ice crept across the windows, the shared warmth of the household became a silent pact, a testament to their fact that when the world turns hostile, the strongest defence is the unity of all living things within the walls. When the world outside was locked in a crystalline grip of ice and snow, the exterior work, the ploughing, the sowing, the harvesting, came to a necessary enforced halt. For the medieval peasant, this was not a holiday. It was a transition into a different, more sedentary, yet equally demanding form of labour. The cottage, once a place of rest after a long day in the fields, transformed into a miniature workshop where the gears of the household economy continue to turn. The primary task during these winter months was the preparation of textiles. While the sheep had been shorn during the warmer seasons, it was in the heart of winter that the wool was carded, spun, and woven. This was a meditative rhythmic process that defined the household's interior life. Sitting near the light of the hearth, the family would work the spindles, the soft whir of the wooden tools filling the space, competing with the crackle of the fire. Every movement was practiced, efficient and deeply habitual. To spin thread was to spin the very fabric of one's future, ensuring that as clothing wore thin, it could be patched or replaced. Beyond textiles, the winter was a time for the repair of tools. The wooden handles of rakes and scythes were sanded down. Leather straps for horse tack were oiled and mended, and baskets were woven from willow branches gathered in late autumn. These chores required focus and precision, demanding a level of concentration that kept the mind sharp even when the body was confined to a small, smoky space. The isolation of the winter could have easily led to a lethargic, hopeless state, but this culture of constant, small-scale production ensured that everyone had a purpose. There was a profound psychological element to this work. In a world where the future was always uncertain, the ability to create something with one's own hands, to transform raw wool into cloth or raw wood into a sturdy handle, provided a crucial sense of agency. It was a defiant act of creation in the face of nature's destruction. By working, the villagers maintained their dignity, They reminded them that they were not merely victims of the elements, but active participants in their own survival. These hours of labour were also times of education. The older generation would teach the younger how to carve, how to weave, and how to spot the subtle imperfections in the raw materials that could lead to failure. Knowledge was passed down through the repetition of physical tasks, binding the generations together through the work of their hands. The cottage would be filled with the quiet murmur of conversation, a contrast to the howling wind outside. It was a social, productive, and essential rhythm. Through these long, dark months, they learned that as long as they were crafting, mending, and building, they were moving forward. They were not just waiting for the spring, they were preparing for it, layer by layer, thread by thread. In the medieval winter, the boundary between the physical and the metaphysical grew remarkably thin. When the snow rendered the roads impassable, and the silence of the woods became heavy with an almost predatory weight, the villagers turned their eyes toward the heavens. For them, the blizzard was not just a meteorological phenomenon. It was a testament to a world governed by forces far beyond their control. Religion was not a Sunday obligation. It was the foundation upon which their sanity rested. In the flickering light of the hearth, families would recite prayers, seeking protection for their livestock, their harvest, and their neighbours. These were not prayers of grand ambition, but of quiet, urgent survival. They prayed for the sun to return, for the ice to break, and for the strength to endure one more week, one more day, one more hour. The church was the anchor of the community, and even when the drifts were too deep to reach the parish, the act of prayer remained a vital, daily pulse within the home. The concept of providence, the belief that they were watched over by a higher power, was a powerful psychological buffer against the isolation of the winter. It gave them a framework to understand their suffering. It was not a punishment, but a trial to be endured with grace. This belief fostered a sense of stoicism that allowed them to bear the biting cold without descending into madness or despair. They found comfort in the cycles of the liturgical year, marking the passage of the darkest days with candles, simple songs, and the hope of the coming spring, which was symbolically linked to the promise of rebirth. This endurance is part of what makes our collective human story so compelling. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the resilient spirit of the past, please consider hitting the like button. It helps our community grow and ensures these stories of history's forgotten endurance reach more people who, like you, appreciate the weight of time and the beauty of human survival. Your interaction is a vital part of our storytelling process. Let us know in the comments, what is the most fascinating thing you've discovered about how our ancestors handled the cold? Faith also manifested in the folk traditions that intertwined with the religious. Superstitions about hearth spirits, the protection of the home threshold, and the blessing of the fields were all part of a tapestry of hope. They used whatever tools they had, whether it was a worn wooden cross hung above the door or a whispered prayer for the animals, to create a perimeter of safety against the darkness. This was a world where humanity reached out into the unseen, seeking a connection that transcended the freezing mud and the barren fields. It was this refusal to be crushed by the cold, this insistence on holding on hope in the darkest of nights, that allowed the human spirit to bridge the gap between one winter and the next. Survival through a medieval winter was as much a biological battle as it was a physical one. With the onset of the bitter cold, the human body became susceptible to a host of ailments, chilblains, severe distress, and the persistent, bone-chilling dampness that seemed to seep into one's very marrow. In the absence of modern medicine or a local apothecary, the village had to become its own physician. The knowledge of healing was often held by the matriarchs or the village elders, passed down through generations in a quiet, oral tradition of herbal wisdom. The garden might have been buried under a blanket of snow, but the drying racks inside the cottage were full of treasures. Bundles of dried thyme, sage and mint hung from the rafters, ready to be infused into hot broths or teas. Thyme, in particular, was prized for its antiseptic property and its ability to soothe the persistent coughs that plagued the household during the long, smoky months indoors. Willow bark, gathered in the warmer months, was carefully prepared as a primitive but effective analgesic for the joint pain brought on by the damp, unyielding cold. For the skin, which suffered daily from the freezing draughts and the harshness of the hearth, fats were essential. The rendered tallow of sheep or pigs, often mixed with a bit of crushed herbs, served as a protective balm. This was not merely about comfort. It was a necessary shield against skin cracking and infection, which could turn a minor frostbite into life-threatening ordeal. The hygiene of the home was also a form of preventative medicine. Despite the confined space and the presence of livestock, the constant mucking of the floors and the use of fresh rushes helped to keep the air breathable and the living environment from becoming a breeding ground for sickness. There was a profound humility in these practices. The people recognized that they were part of nature's cycle, and they utilized the same earth that provided their food to provide their medicine. They understood the properties of the forest edge and the hidden virtues of common weeds. If someone fell ill, the community rallied. The sick were moved closer to the hearth, given the warmest spot near the fire, and nursed with warm drinks and careful attention. In this era, the recovery of a neighbour was not just a personal success, it was a communal victory. Every person was a vital component of the village's labour force, and losing someone to a winter fever was a blow to everyone. The medicinal practices of the time were a blend of practical observation, trial and error, and a deep intuitive trust in the healing power of the natural world. They didn't always win, and the mortality rates were high, but the determination to care for one another, to use the dried herbs, the warm tallow, and the simple act of human presence was a testament to their resilience. It was a medicine of the heart as much as the body, insistence that life should be sustained, protected, and nurtured, even when the world outside was frozen to the core. When the world outside was reduced to a terrifying expanse of white, and the sun was a mere ghost behind heavy clouds, the medieval cottage became a sanctuary of sound. Silence in the depth of winter was a heavy burden. It carried the weight of the unknown and the isolation of the frozen wilderness. To combat this, the villagers crafted their own atmosphere, one built on the rhythm of voices, the cadence of stories, and the resonance of music. Even in the most humble home, someone could always whistle a tune, pluck a simple string instrument, or keep time by beating a drum made from cured hide. Music was not a luxury, it was a rhythmic pulse that kept the heart from slowing down. It reminded them that they were still alive, still human, and still connected to the world beyond the walls. Songs were often passed down through oral tradition, tales of heroic ancestors, long lost summers, or humorous fables that had been told for generations. These stories served as a cognate anchor, preventing the mind from drifting in the despair that constant darkness often brought. They played simple games, too, tossing carved wooden dice, playing strategy games with pebbles or sticks, or engaging in intricate string puzzles that tested both focus and patience. These moments of play were vital. They provide a much-needed mental break from the grueling survival tasks of the day. In these moments, the fire didn't just warm their bodies. The communal laughter and the shared focus warmed their spirits, melting the ice that threatened to settle in their souls. This incredible depth of the human spirit, the way we find light even when the world is draped in shadow, is what defines our history. If you have found yourself moved by this journey through the medieval winter, I invite you to join our growing community of history lovers. Please subscribe to Sleepy History with Kevin and hit the notification bell. Your feedback is what drives our creative process. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you were transported back to the 4th century, what is the one modern comfort you would miss the most? Let's keep this conversation alive as we continue to explore the fascinating tapestry of our past. Every story, every melody, and every shared laugh was a victory against the cold. It was a statement of defiance. By filling the dark corners of the cottage with song and story, they transformed their home into a fortress of culture and memory. They weren't just surviving, they were living, even when the world outside tried its hardest to force them into hibernation. These performances, whether a song sung by a young mother to her child or an old man's retelling of a village legend, were the threads that held the community together. Through the biting cold and the long sleepless nights, they kept the flame of their humanity burning, bright and unwavering, until the first subtle signs of spring began to whisper through the frozen thatch. The transition from winter to spring was never an instantaneous relief. It was a slow, agonizingly beautiful process, a period of transition where the world hung in a delicate, trembling balance. Even as the sun began to assert its authority, the frost clung to the shadows of the thatched roofs and the deep crevices of the forest floor, refusing to relinquish its hold. The air remained sharp, a constant reminder that the winter had been a formidable adversary, one that did not vanish with the first warm breeze. In these final days of the icy regime, the mood in the cottage was one of quiet, watchful anticipation. The stored grain supplies were at their lowest. The woodpile was a skeleton of its former self, and the livestock, weary from their confinement, began to stir with an instinctual awareness of the changing pressure in the air. Every member of the household, from the eldest to the youngest, moved with a heightened sense of purpose. They knew that while the worst had passed, the danger of a late-season blizzard remained a possibility, a final spiteful snap of the cold that could undo all their efforts. This period was a test of patience. The temptation to throw open the doors and rush into the fields was strong, but the collective wisdom of the village demanded caution. They spent their days checking the fences, sharpening the iron of the ploughs, and assessing the state of the village lanes, now turning into churned mud under the melting ice. They were living in the in-between, a space where the memory of the blizzard was still vivid, yet the promise of the first green shoots was becoming undeniable. There was a profound beauty in this waiting. It was a time of reflection, a quiet interval where the exhaustion of the long survival gave way to a burgeoning sense of rebirth. They watched the birds return, their calls cutting through the lingering chill, and they tracked the slow retreat of the snow line up the hillsides. They were observing the very height of the earth as it began to quicken. It was a shared experience of profound relief and cautious hope, a silent acknowledgement that they had endured, and that the path ahead, while still uncertain, was beginning to brighten. The village was preparing not just for the planting, but for the continuation of their story. They understood that their survival was not an ending, but a perpetual cycle, and they stood at the edge of this new dawn with a weary yet indomitable spirit. They were ready for whatever the spring would bring, their foundations strengthened by the trials of the winter, their resolve tempered by the frost, and their hearts braced for the warmth of the sun that was soon to arrive. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. As the last patches of snow surrendered to the encroaching warmth, the village did not simply breathe a collective sigh of relief. The arrival of spring brought with it a different kind of pressure. For the medieval peasant, the thaw was the signal that the heavy mantle of winter had been replaced by the equally demanding burden of the feudal contract. The manor lords, who had spent the cold months within their own heated walls, now cast their eyes toward the fields. The cycle of labour, ploughing, sowing, and the relentless maintenance of the lord's demesne began immediately. This period was a stark reminder of the political reality of medieval England. The peasantry lived in a delicate state of dependency. The land they worked was not their own, and the fruits of their labour were heavily taxed, not just by the church, but by the local nobility. As the mud dried and the village lanes became navigable, the tax collectors, the bailiffs, and the stewards would arrive. They arrived to measure the remaining stores, to oversee the planting, and to ensure that the obligations of the serfdom were met. The winter had tested their bodies, but the spring tested their loyalty and their endurance under the weight of feudal hierarchy. Yet there was a strange defiant pride in this labour. Even as they sowed the field for others, the villagers were also tending to their small private patches of land. The tofts, where they grew the vegetable and kept the few chickens that ensured their own families would not starve when the next winter inevitably descended. This dual existence, serving the Lord while striving for personal survival, defined the socio-political fabric of the era. It was a life of quiet negotiation, where the peasant learned to navigate the whims of the powerful while clinging to the rhythms of the earth. The scarcity caused by a severe winter often triggered local tensions, grain prices would soar, and the distribution of resource became a focal point of village politics. Disputes over boundaries, access to water, or the use of common lands would resurface with the sun. It was in these moments that the village council, or the informal gathering of elders, became critical. They had to balance the demands of the nobility with the survival needs of their kin. It was a complex game of survival, played out in the fields, the courtyards, and the halls of the manor. As the trees began to bud, and the first birds of migration returned, the villagers looked out over the landscape, not with the carefree joy of a new beginning, but with a seasoned strategic awareness. They knew that the land was only as good as the hands that worked it, and the peace of the village was only as stable as the cooperation of its inhabitants. They were entering a season of growth, but it was a growth forged in the crucible of frost. The politics of the manor, the demands of the church, and the harsh realities of their station were all intertwined with the simple urgent need to keep their families fed. And so the rhythm continued, a delicate, unwritten dance of life, power, and the endurance of the common folk against the backdrop of indifferent feudal structure. As the earth softened and the first green shoots of winter wheat began to pierce the thawing crust, the atmosphere of the village underwent a profound transformation. The tension of survival, which had been the constant companion of the long nights, gradually gave way to a spirit of guarded celebration. In the medieval mind, nature was not a separate entity to be observed from a distance. It was a rhythmic partner. The arrival of spring was not merely a meteorological event. It was a sacred occasion, a signal that the cycle of life had successfully navigated the valley of the shadow of death. This sense of relief found its expression in the festivals that punctuated the turning of the calendar. These were moments where the rigid social hierarchies and the grueling labour of the manor were, for a few precious hours, set aside. The villagers engaged in traditions that were as ancient as the land itself, often blending Christian observance with older, folk-rooted rituals designed to ensure the fertility of the soil and the health of the cattle. May Day, for instance, became a focal point for the entire community. It was a time to bring the green back in the home, to weave garlands, and to engage in dances that mimicked the growth of the crops. Music, once used to drown out the howling wind in the hearth, now took on a lighter, more vibrant tone. Pipes, tabors, and voices filled the air, reclaiming the village green as a space for community bonding. These celebrations served a vital sociological function. They reinforced the bonds of the village. By dancing together, eating together, and singing the songs of their ancestors, the people affirmed that they were a collective unit, not just a collection of struggling individuals. It was a communal act of defiance against the harshness of the past winter. Yet even in these moments of joy, there was an underlying thread of pragmatism. The rituals were not just for fun. They were, in the view of the time, essential to the success of the harvest. The blessing of the fields by the parish priest, the procession around the boundary stones, and the symbolic offerings were all part of a complex system of insurance. In a world where a late frost or a blight could mean famine, every act was designed to tip the scales in their favour. This was the intersection of faith and survival, a deep intuitive belief that if the people honoured the earth and their traditions, the earth would, in turn, provide for them. This period also saw the return of itinerant traders, travelling players, and pilgrims to the village tracks, which had finally become dry enough to travel. The arrival of an outsider was a major event, bringing news from distant manors, stories of the outside world, and perhaps a bit of salt or iron that could not be found within the village limits. The village, which had been an isolated island during the blizzard, was now opening its gates to the wider world. It was a time of information exchange and a renewal of trade, essential for the village to function with a broader context of the kingdom. Each festival, each shared meal, and each interaction with the outside world helped to dissolve the claustrophobia of the winter. They were building their world, piece by piece, relationship by relationship. They moved through these spring rites with a renewed sense of purpose, their hands calloused from the winter's toil, but their hearts lightened by the promise of the coming sun. The cycle was turning once again, and for now the threat of the cold had been pushed back in the pages of their collective memory, waiting for its turn to return in the cycles to come. As the mud solidified into hardened tracks, the village ceased to be an island of solitude. The roads, which had been impassable rivers of mire during the thaw, now hummed with the slow, deliberate movement of trade and travel. In the medieval English hierarchy, the road was the artery through which the lifeblood of the realm news, law, and coin flowed. For the villagers, who had spent months within the claustrophobic confines of their own hearths, the appearance of a traveller at the village threshold was nothing short of a miracle. These travellers were a die's lot, the wandering pedlar with his pack full of needles, thread, and rare spices, the barefoot friar seeking alms, the weary messenger carrying parchment rolls from one manor to another, or the pilgrim journeying toward a distant shrine. Each one brought with them a fragment of a world far larger than the parish boundaries. They spoke of regional conflicts, the shifting taxes imposed by the king's collectors, or the latest rumours of crop failures in the south. In the quiet evenings, as these strangers shared the warmth of the village fire, the villagers hung on every word. Their world expanded beyond the familiar horizon. This influx of information was not merely entertainment, it was a survival necessity. A peddler's news about the price of wool in the regional market could dictate whether a family sold their clip now or risked waiting for a better return. A friar's sermon could alter the local perception of moral obligations toward the manor lord. Through these interactions, the villagers began to see their own struggles mirrored or contrasted with those in other parts of the kingdom. They learned that the winter which had ravaged their hamlet had perhaps been less severe in the valley beyond the ridge, or conversely, that the famine they narrowly avoided had crippled the prosperity of a neighbouring village. The arrival of the road also meant return of the manor's administrative reach. The stewards and the king's taxmen, having voided the winter's bite, now used these improved roads to enforce the laws of the realm. This brought the tension of feudal politics directly to the village green. Disputes that had been managed internally during the long winter were now subject to the scrutiny of external authorities. The village became a theatre of legal, social, and economic negotiation. They had to be shrewd, balancing the need to stay under the radar of the law, with the requirement to contribute to the greater wealth of the lord and the kingdom. Yet, there was also shared humanity in these counters. As the village opened itself up, the residents found that their experiences of survival were universal. Travellers exchanged stories of their own winter trials, sharing techniques for storing grain or preserving leather, creating a silent, unofficial network of shared knowledge. This was the true strength of the medieval road. It was not just for the movement of goods, but for the fusion of the resilient human spirit. As the village watched the travellers depart toward the next destination, they felt a sense of connection, a realization that their struggle was but one small thread in a vast, intricate tapestry of a nation emerging from the cold and in the relentless, demanding light of a new season. As the spring sun fully claimed the sky, casting a golden hue over the freshly ploughed fields, a quiet transformation took place within the collective consciousness of the village. The struggle for survival had been intense, marked by the biting cold and the long, dark shadows of the blizzard, yet there was a profound sense of permanence in their existence. They had not just survived, they had borne witness to the cyclical nature of time itself. For the medieval peasant, history was not a linear progression toward a distant goal, but a living, breathing circle, a sequence of harvest and hunger, winter and warmth, endurance and renewal. This period of relative peace allowed for reflection. In the quiet moments between the heavy labour of the planting season, the villagers would look out over the familiar landscape, the stone walls they had built, the paths they had worn into the earth, and the hearths that had shielded them. They realized that their lives were the mortar between the bricks of history. While the annals of the realm focused on the movements of kings, the decrees of bishops, and the shifting borders of wars, it was the persistent, daily survival of these ordinary people that truly anchored the kingdom. Their resilience was the silent bedrock upon which the entire social and political structure rested. They passed this awareness on to their children, not through books or scrolls, but through the rhythm of their daily lives. The young learned that the cold was not to be feared, but to be understood and mitigated. They learned that the strength of a community was measured not by its wealth, but by its capacity for shared sacrifice. Every lesson learned from the winter, every technique of insulation, every method of food preservation, every song used to sustain morale, became a part of the village's communal heritage. This was the true invisible legacy of the Middle Ages, a storehouse of wisdom that allowed humanity to persist across the centuries. The world outside the village was also changing. The winds of innovations, the slow shifting of power dynamics were beginning to stir, but for those rooted in the soil. The primary mandate remained unchanged: to work the land, to honour the community, and to prepare for the inevitable return of the seasons. They stood on the edge of a new cycle, their eyes tempered by the memories of the snow, yet bright with the hope of the coming harvest. They knew that when the winter returned, and it would return with all its icy ferocity, they would be ready. They had become masters of their own endurance, architects of their own small flickering lights in the vast indifferent dark. As they looked toward the horizon, they saw not a threat, but a challenge to be met with the same steady hands and unshakable that had carried them through the frost. The story of their survival was not written in the glory of the sword, but in the quiet, steady persistence of the hearth. And so the village continued, a small, vibrant pulse of life in the heart of the English countryside, ready to face whatever the future held, anchored by the knowledge that, as long as they remained together, they were far more than the sum of their struggles. While the blizzard was a silent, suffocating force, the woods that bordered the village were home to a much more immediate, primal form of danger. As the deep winter deepened its grip, the natural prey of the forest grew scarce. The deer retreated to deeper thickets, and the smaller game burrowed deep beneath the frozen earth. This biologic scarcity forced the predators, wolves in particular, to abandon their natural shyness, and turn their amber, hungry eyes toward the only source of warmth and sustenance left, the village. For the medieval peasant, the wolf was more than an animal. It was a figure of folklore and a symbol of the untamable chaos that existed just beyond the village boundary. During the long nights, when the hearth fire burned low, and the wind carried the howls of a pack moving through the tree line, the atmosphere within the cottage shifted. The livestock, sensing the approach of a predator, would become restless, their sudden panicked movements alerting the family to the presence of an unwanted guest. This was the perimeter, not just a physical fence of wood and stone, but a psychological line of defence that separated the ordered life of the hearth from the wild, indifferent hunger of the forest. This constant low-level vigilance added a layer of fatigue to winter experience. Every night was a test of the barriers. The pens had to be reinforced with extra timber, the gates secured with iron hooks, and the dogs, the village's loyal, shaggy sentinels, kept on high alert. It was a silent war of nerves played out under the moonlight. The villagers knew that a single breach could mean the loss of their primary livestock, which, as we have seen, was the very foundation of their economic and physical survival. Yet, this struggle with the wild was also a profound teacher. It forced the village to operate as a single coordinated defence. The village watchman, though not a professional military force, would take turns patrolling the edges of the settlement, carrying torches and spears. This shared responsibility fostered a deep, instinctual trust between neighbours. They learned the habits of the land. They knew which parts of the forest edge were the most likely routes for a prowling pack, and they understood the signs that nature gave before a raid. This tension between the ordered and the wild helped to shape the medieval identity. They viewed the world as a place where humanity lived in a constant state of negotiation with nature. They did not seek to conquer the forest. They sought to carve out a pocket of safety within it, constantly aware that the moment they let their guard down, the wild would reclaim its space. This awareness made the peace of the spring even more precious. When the sun finally warmed the earth and the predators retreat back in the deep woods, the sense of liberation was not just from the cold, but from the relentless creeping fear that had lurked just outside the door for months. It was a cycle of vigilance and relief that defined their mastery over their immediate environment, proving that even against the teeth of the wild, the human will to protect what is theirs remains the most potent force in the landscape. As the thaw solidified in the rhythm of spring, the village faced a practical challenge that tested the very structure of their society, the distribution of common resources. After the constraints of winter, the boundaries of land, the access to communal grazing pastures, and the rights to timber became the focal points of community life. In medieval England, these were not merely economic decisions, they were the bedrock of village politics, governed by a complex, unwritten code of precedent and custom. There were no written statutes for the peasant to consult in the village square. Instead, the law was a living entity held in the collective memory of the elders. They remembered where the boundary stones were buried, whose family had the right to harvest the willow near the creek, and how the rotation of the common fields had been managed for generations. When a dispute arose perhaps over a stray heifer grazing on a neighbour's rye plot, it was brought before the village moot, an informal assembly that met under the shade of old oak or within the local churchyard. This process of conflict resolution was a testament to the sophistication of medieval rural society. The goal was rarely total victory for one side, but rather the restoration of the balance. A fine might be levied, often paid in kind, a bushel of grain or a day's labour, to be used for the benefit of the entire village. They understood, with a pragmatism born of survival, that a feud between neighbours was a luxury they could not afford. Discord weakened the village's collective ability to withstand the next cycle of seasons. The management of the common, the vast shared land where the village animals grazed, was particularly vital. As the grass began to green, the villagers had to decide which areas would be rested and which would be grazed to ensure there was enough forage for the entire summer. It required a deep synchronized cooperation. If one family grazed, everyone suffered. This was a form of communal social lives, dictated by the harsh realities of the era. They were bound together by their shared reliance on the same limited geography. This internal governance was a shield against external interference. By settling their own disputes, the villagers kept the intrusive eyes of the manor lords' bailiffs at bay. They knew that if the lord or the royal courts became involved, the costs in time, money, autonomy would be far higher. Therefore the village moot was a mechanism of self-preservation. It taught the individual that their rights were intrinsically linked to their responsibilities to the collective. In the quiet debates over a plough line or the access to a forest path, one could see the origins of a resilient social order. It was a society that had learned, through centuries of frost and famine, that justice was not an abstract concept handed down from above, but a practical agreement forged on the ground, in the mud, and by the consensus of those who had lived through the winter together. While the villagers looked to the elders for the laws of the land, they looked to the sky for the laws of existence. Without calendars or clocks, the medieval peasant developed a sophisticated, observational relationship with the heavens. The movement of the sun, the shifting positions of the constellations, and the cycles of the moon were the definitive markers of their world. This celestial clock was the ultimate arbiter of when to break the frost, harden soil, when to sow the seeds, and when to prepare for the inevitable return of the darkness. Their knowledge was deeply intuitive. A villager didn't need to read a star chart to Nat when certain stars peered above the eastern ridge at twilight. It was time to move the sheep to the higher pastures. They watched for the greening of the woods in relation to the position of the sun, understanding that nature's clock was far more reliable than any man-made invention. This was an advanced form of practical science. It required generations of meticulous observation, an oral tradition where knowledge of the sky was passed down alongside the knowledge of the plough. This connection to the cosmos also permeated their spirituality. The solstices and the equinoxes were not just dates. They were spiritual milestones that dictated the rhythm of church and cottage alike. They understood that the world was moving in a grand, predictable loop. By aligning their labour with the heavens, they felt a sense of harmony that helped alleviate the anxiety of their carrier lives. If they followed the signs, they believed they were doing everything in their power to ensure a successful harvest, which in turn meant survival for another year. It was a humbling perspective. Standing in the middle of a vast, open field under a sky crowded with stars, the peasant felt both infinitesimally small and deeply connected to the order of the universe. The stars were their witnesses, the moon was their guide during the harvest nights, and the sun was their taskmaster. This relationship with the celestial helped them endure the periods of uncertainty. When the weather was unpredictable or the rain refused to fall, they looked to the heavens not just with worry, but with the familiarity of one checking on a neighbour. This astronomical literacy gave them a sense of control in a world that often felt chaotic. It allowed them to plan, to anticipate, and to adapt. Even in the darkest depths of a blizzard, the knowledge that the sun would inevitably return to its summer position provide a psychological beacon of hope. They were living in synchrony with the turning of the globe, their lives intricately woven in the mechanical beauty of the seasons. It was a testament to human resilience, the ability to find order in the infinite, to map the vastness of the sky to the small muddy furrows of a single humble field. The medieval village was not merely a cluster of huts, it was a workshop of remarkable, practical ingenuity. In an era for standardized mass production, every tool was a bespoke artifact, forged and shaped to meet the specific requirements of the local soil and the peculiar challenges of the terrain. The smithy, located at the heart of the village, was the beating, metallic pulse of this endeavour. Here, the transformation of raw iron into the assemblements of life was a sacred, guarded process. A plough was not just a plough. The heavy clay soils of England required a heavy plough, a massive construction of wood reinforced with iron coulters and shares, capable of turning the stubborn earth. The village understood that a poorly forged ploughshare would not just slow down the spring planting, it could lead to catastrophic failure when the window for sowing was narrow. Thus, the relationship between the farmer and the blacksmith was one of absolute necessity. They consulted on the temper of the metal, the balance of the wooden frame, and the ergonomic weight of the handles. Every dent, every weld, and every repair carried the history of the land it had worked. Beyond the forge, the woodwork skills of the villagers were equally sophisticated. The selection of the right timber was an art form in itself. Ash was prized for its flexibility and strength, essential for the shafts of scythes and the handles of axes, while oak was reserved for the foundations of their structures and the more permanent components of their carts. They knew how to season the wood, how to steam, bend it for maximum durability, and how to utilize the natural grain of the timber to resist the warping effects of the damp, cold winters. These tools were the extension of the human body. They were designed for longevity and repairability. When a tool broke, it was never discarded. The broken handle was whittled down to a smaller size. The rusted iron was forged into a smaller implement, and every scrap of leather or cordage was repurposed. This culture of repair was the ultimate survival strategy. It reflected a deep intuitive understanding of resource. In a world where access to raw materials was dictated by the seasons and the Lord's permission, nothing could be wasted. As the spring sun warmed the workshop, the clanging of the hammer on the anvil provided a constant rhythmic soundtrack to the village's renewal. This was the technology of the age, a blend of experience, trial and error, and an intimate knowledge of the physical world. It taught the villagers that they were not powerless in the face of the elements. By applying logic, force, and a keen eye to the raw materials provided by the forest and the earth, they could impose their will upon the landscape. They didn't just survive the elements, they engineered their way through them, building a foundation of resilience that allowed their community to thrive, generation after generation, one sharpened edge at a time. For the medieval peasant, the forest that encroached upon the village was neither wall nor a wilderness to be conquered. It was a complex, living vernacular. They understood a language of signs that the modern mind has largely forgotten. The way a bird signaled an approaching gale, the specific scent of bruised pine needles before a heavy frost, or the way the moss grew on the sheltered side of the bark, these were not mere observations, but essential data points that dictated the survival of the household. This language of the land was transmitted through the generations with a precision that bordered on the scientific. A young child would be taught to listen to the difference between the wind moving through dry leaves and the rustle of a predator stalking through the undergrowth. They learned that the forest was a stratified environment, the lower canopy, the forest floor, and the damp ravines. Each had their own personality and utility. A particular patch of ferns might indicate a deep water table, while the density of brambles could reveal the fertility of the soil beneath. This wasn't mysticism, it was hyperlocal, practical geography. The woods served as a pharmacy, a hardware store, and a larder. The villagers knew exactly when the sap would be richest in the birch trees, how to harvest the inner bark for its medicinal properties, and which fungi were safe to dry for the winter months. They approached the woods with a ritualized respect, not out of sentimentality, but because they knew the thin margin between a resource and a danger. To take too much, to disturb the habitat, or to venture too deep into the sacred grooves, was to risk upsetting the balance that kept the village alive. Furthermore, these woods provided the village with a hidden defensive network. During times of unrest or the passing of tax collectors, the forest served as a place of refuge. The village knew every hidden hollow and overgrown path, allowing them to effectively vanish from the view of those who demanded their labour and their taxes. The forest was their camouflage, their secret vault, and their ultimate fail. Safe, it was a space where the heavy hand of feudal law became dilute by the tangled reality of nature. This relationship was one of mutual recognition. The forest was the provider, but it was also the boundary that enforced the village isolation. By learning the rhythm of the wild, The villagers transformed their environment into a partner. They knew that when the woods fell deathly silent, something was wrong, a storm was brewing, or a threat was nearby. This silent vernacular allowed them to navigate the world with a sense of security that the outsider lost in the shadows would never possess. It was a testament to how profoundly the medieval mind was rooted in its geography, creating a civilization that was not just built on the land, but in total, constant conversation with it. If the great Roman roads were the spine of the realm, the narrow, winding footpaths that Spider webbed across the countryside were its nerves. These were not engineered thoroughfares. They were desire lines worn into the earth by the cumulate weight of thousands of boots, clogs, and hooves over centuries. For the villagers, these paths were the primary conduits of their existence. A path was never just a way to reach a neighbour's barn. It was a connection to the village collective memory. Every path had a character defined by the terrain it traversed. There were the sunken lanes, cut deep in the soft limestone by centuries of use and rainwater, providing a sheltered corridor for the weary traveller. There were the field ways, which shifted slightly each season as the crop rotation dictated the boundaries of the common fields. To walk these paths was to engage in a physical dialogue with the ancestor who had carved them. An elder could look at a junction in the woods and tell you exactly why the path took a sharp detour to the left, perhaps, to avoid a spring that flooded every autumn, or to pass by a marker stone that commemorated a long, forgotten harvest. These footpaths were also the silent witnesses to the shifting power dynamics of the Middle Ages. During times of war or heavy taxation, these secondary routes became the arteries of resistance. A tax collector might ride the king's high road, but the villagers knew the hidden hollow ways that allowed them to move livestock or grain out of sight. The paths were where news was exchanged, not the grand proclamations of the crown, but the vital ground-level information. Which local squire was lenient with his tenant obligations, where the harvest had been bountiful, or which market town had the most honest scale. There was a profound psychology to the footpath. It fostered a sense of local sovereignty. When you walked a path you had helped maintain, you were reinforcing your claim to the landscape. Unlike the rigid vertical hierarchies of the manor and the church, the footpath was inherently horizontal, a space where the individual moved at their own pace, following the logic of the land rather than the decree of a lord. It was in the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath their feet that the villagers found their autonomy. As the season shifted toward the intensity of summer, these paths became even more crucial. They linked the isolated hamlets into a web of mutual aid, allowing for the rapid exchange of labour during the frantic days of haymaking. A village that was connected by a well-tended neck of paths was a village that could weather the shocks of history. Today, many of these ancient footpaths are lost beneath asphalt or buried under agriculture expansion, but in the 4th century they were very definition of the world. They were the physical proof that the people were not stationary subjects of a lord, but active, moving participants in the geography of their own lives. To follow the path was to accept the invitation of the landscape to keep moving, to keep connecting, and to keep the story of the community flowing like a river across the surface of the earth. In the medieval village, knowledge did not reside in leather-bound volumes or cold stone archives. It lived in the breath, the cadence, and the collective memory of the people. When the sun dipped below the horizon, and the village settled in the blue-grey twilight, the fireplace became a sanctuary of information. This was the era of the living archive, where every grandpa was a chronicler and every storyteller was a guardian of the past. The stories shared around the hearth were not mere fables to pass the time. They were the scaffolding of their civilization. They carried the code of the community, lessons on what plants were poisonous, how to negotiate with a manding bailiff, or the moral weight of a promise made in the shadow of the church. These narratives were highly rhythmic, often set to simple, repetitive melodies, which made them easier to memorize. The history of a flood in the year of the Great Frost, or the lineage of a family's land rights, was encoded in song. It was a sophisticated demonic system, ensuring that wisdom survived even when the written record was inaccessible. There was a profound political dimension to this oral tradition. By sharing stories of local heroes, those who had resisted unjust taxes or defended the village against encroaching power, the people kept a sense of collective dignity alive. These tales act as a form of cultural resistance. They subtly reminded the youth that while the manor lord might own the land, the history of the land belonged to those who worked it. The storyteller, often an elder with a voice weathered by the seasons, held a position of quiet, immense authority. They were the ones who curated the community's identity, deciding which events were worth preserving and which grievances were worthy of being passed down to the next generation. This oral vernacular also bridged the gap between the sacred and the profane. Stories of saints were woven seamlessly with tales of forest spirits and local legends. For the medieval peasant, there was no sharp line between the divine and the everyday. Both existed in the same narrative space. This synthesis helped them make sense of the unpredictability of their lives. When a season was harsh, it was framed within a story of testing and eventual redemption. When the village faced a crisis, they invoked the ancestral voice, drawing strength from the knowledge that their forebears had faced similar storms and prevailed. As a listener, you weren't just an audience member. You were an active participant in the preservation of the community. To remember a story correctly, to pass it on to a child, was a duty of the higher order. It was the ultimate act of defiance against the erasure of time. In these moments of shared storytelling, the cold outside mattered less. The village became a theatre of memory, a place where the past and the present converged, and where the human spirit was reinforced not by gold or steel, but by the resonance of a voice speaking in the dark. They were not just surviving, they were curating a legacy, one stanza at a time. In the medieval village, the boundary between the kitchen garden and the pharmacy was non-existent. When the long, damp winter finally broke, the local healer, often a woman whose wisdom was as rooted as the ancient oaks, became the most critical figure in the community. Their knowledge was not found in the Latin texts of distant universities. It was scribed in the soil, the roots, and the bitter sap of the hedgerows. This was vernacular medicine, a survival skill as vital as the forging of a plough or the sowing of grain. The healer's ledger was her memory. She knew exactly which willow bark could dull the throb of a winter, worn joint, how the infusion of stinging nettle could revive a body. Weakened by months of salt, meat rations and which fungi, if applied with the right poultice, could stave off the rot of infected cut. This was not magic, though it was often shrouded in ritual. It was a highly specialized empirical science. Over centuries of trial and error, the villagers had mapped the healing potential of every plant with a 3-mile radius of the village green. This medical culture was fundamentally communal. The herbs were gathered by the children, processed by the mothers, and stored in the rafters of every cottage. When a fever swept through the huts, a common event when the spring thaw released the impurities trapped, In the mud, it was not just the healer who acted. The entire village shifted into mode of nursing care. They shared the precious stores of dried honey and fermented potions. In this, they were practicing a primitive but effective form of socialized healthcare, acknowledging that the system of one member threatened the stability of the entire collective. Yet this knowledge was perpetually under pressure. During the medieval period, the line between wise woman and heretic could be dangerously thin. The Church viewed the rituals accompanying these remedies with suspicion, often labelling them as remnants of pagan superstition. The healer thus walked a precarious path, balancing the need to save lives with the need to avoid the judgmental gaze of the parish authorities. They operated in the grey spaces of society, their work often done in the soft light of dawn or the hush of midnight, making their contribution both hidden and heroic. As we look at these practices today, we see more than just primitive medicine. We see a profound respect for the biological complexity of the world. The medieval peasant understood that they were part of ecosystem, and that the same earth that provided their food also contained the keys to their recovery. They lived in a state of reciprocal healing. They tended the land, and in times of distress, the land returned the favour. It was a testament to their resilience, a quiet, insistent refusal to surrender to the fragility of the human body, even when faced with the harsh, indifferent realities of a world that offered no easy cures. Every tincture bottled, every poultice applied, and every prayer whispered over a sick child was a defiance of the darkness, a small, persistent light in the long, uncertain history of survival. Not everyone in the medieval world was tethered to the soil of their birth. Between the rigid layers of the feudal hierarchy moved a class of people essential to the pulse of the realm, the wandering craftsmen. These were the tinkers, the menders of stoneware, the sharpener of blades, and the itinerant carpenters. They lived in the spaces between the manors, traversing the ancient tracks and footpaths that the king's tax collectors largely ignored. They were the unofficial conduits of technology, style, and most importantly, information. When a wandering tinker arrived at the village gate, it was an event that disrupted the monotony of the seasonal cycle. They carried their entire livelihood on their backs, or on the back of a weary mule. Their arrival signalled a rare opportunity for the villagers to acquire knowledge from beyond the ridge. While they hammered away at a leaky cauldron or mended a fractured tool, they traded stories. They spoke of how the mills in the neighbouring county were being resigned to catch the wind more efficiently, or of a new method for tanning leather that was spreading from the southern towns. They were the open source network of the 4th century, distributing practical intelligence faster than any royal decree ever could. This mobility gave them a unique and often misunderstood status. They were neither fully integrated in the village life nor entirely shunned. They were the essential others. They provided the specialized labour that a small, self-sufficient hamlet couldn't sustain on its own. A master mason passing through might show a local builder a better way to stack dry stone, or a travelling cobbler might introduce a more durable stitching pattern for winter boots. These small, incremental exchanges were the seeds of innovation. They prevented the rural communities from stagnating, ensuring that even the most isolated valley remained a participant in the broader, shifting technological landscape of the medieval world. Yet their existence was a testament to the risks of the age. They lived exposed to the elements, dependent on the hospitality of the villages they visited, and susceptible to the shifting whims of local law. They knew the hidden geography of the realm, where the streams were shallow, where the local lords were most predatory, and which village gates were always left unbarred. Their survival depended on their ability to be useful, adaptable, and invisible. They were the observers of the kingdom, carrying in their memories a map of England that exists nowhere on parchment. As they packed their tools and moved on toward the next hamlet, they left behind more than just repaired goods. They left behind a subtle shift in the villagers' collective consciousness. They challenged the local norms by their very presence, planting questions in the minds of the villagers. Is there a better way to do this? Have you heard what they're doing in the valley beyond? They were the catalysts of change, the subtle creeping influence that ensured the world was slowly, inexorably moving forward, even if the progress was as quiet as the footsteps on a dirt path. Their lives were a mirror of the medieval spirit, resilient, resourceful, and perpetually in motion, driven by the necessity of the trade and the eternal human desire to see what lay around the next bend in the road. To the medieval mind, the world was not strictly divided in the material and the spiritual. They bled into one another with porous intensity. As the light faded and the hearth became the only bastion against the encroaching dark, the village entered a state of negotiated existence with the unseen. The shadows at the edge of the woods, the creaking of the timber, and the sudden, inexplicable shifts in the wind were not just natural phenomena, they were manifestations of reality that exist just beyond human comprehension. This was not a state of paralyzing fear, but one of meticulous observance. The villagers adhered to a complex, unwritten liturgy of protection. It was found in the small charms carved in the lintels of their doors, the specific arrangements of iron tools left by the threshold, and the prayers whispered before crossing a lonely bridge at night. These were not acts of superstition, but technologies of the soul. They were the tools used to create order in a domain where the laws of nature seemed to dissolve. By performing these rites, the peasant reclaimed agency over the night, turning a period of vulnerability into one of managed safety. The village elders were the keepers of this shadow geography. They knew which ancient burial mounds were to be avoided, which trees were bound by old spirits, and the precise times of the year when the veil between worlds was at its thinnest. This knowledge was essential for the psychological cohesion of the community. In a life characterized by extreme physical hardship and high mortality, these beliefs offered a narrative framework for the inexplicable. A sudden loss or unexpected calamity was not merely bad luck, it was an event that could be named, categorized, and therefore in some way endured. Furthermore, this belief system functioned as a social regulator. The fear of the unseen enforced the boundaries of the known. By maintaining a respectful distance from the deep, untouched parts of the forest or the derelict ruins of the past, the villagers collectively agreed to keep their footprint focused on the cultivated communal space. It kept them concentrate on the hearth, the field, and the family. In this sense, the ghosts and spirits of the medieval landscape were the guardians of the status quo, ensuring that the community remained compact, disciplined, and focused on the survival tasks of the day. Even as the church exerted its formal doctrine, this folk theology persisted, resilient and immovable. It was a private, parallel faith that acknowledged the darkness without letting it consume the light of their efforts. They lived with the constant, quiet awareness that they were not the only occupants of the landscape. They were merely the temporary stewards of the earth, walking through a world populated by the echoes of those who came before and the mysteries of that which lay ahead. As they slept, They did so with the comfort of their rituals, knowing that they had paid the necessary tribute to the night, leaving them free to wake once more to the demands of the sun and the soil. In an age devoid of mechanical clocks, the medieval village existed in a sonic reality dictated by the parish church. The bell was the most potent instrument of authority and cohesion. It was not merely a call to prayer, it was the heart of the community. Its resonance travelled across the fields, through the thickets, and in the deepest hollows, reaching the ears of every labourer, shepherd, and woodcutter. To hear the bell was to be reminded of one's place within the collective. The ringing of the bell was a language unto itself, a code that every villager learned from infancy. A rapid, frantic tolling in emergency, a fire in a barn, a flash flood in the lowlands, or perhaps the alarming sight of armed men cresting the ridge. A slow rhythmic peal marked the passing of time, signalling the start of the workday or the midday rest. Then there were the office bells, marking the liturgical hours that divided the day into spiritual segments. For those working the soil in distant pastures, the bell was their only connection to the synchronized rhythm of the village. It kept them oriented, reminding them that while they were physically isolated by their labour, they were never truly alone. This cathedral of sound served as a psychological bastion against the chaos of the natural world. Nature was indifferent, silent, and unpredictable, but the bell was purposeful, human, and reliable. When a heavy, swirling mist swallowed the landscape, obscuring the horizon and disorienting the traveller, the distant tolling acted as an acoustic compass. It was the thread that pulled the lost back toward the centre. This dependence on the sonic environment made the village soundscape an intimate part of their collective survival strategy. Furthermore, they played a crucial role in the social hierarchy. The frequency and duration of the ringing were often dictated by the occasion, a wedding, a funeral, or a tithe day. Each sound carried a different weight of communal obligation. To ignore the bell was to risk social alienation. To respond to it was to participate in the ongoing maintenance of the village order. The bell ringer, often a man tasked with the physical strain of hauling the heavy rope, was a figure of quiet importance. He was the one who broadcast the pulse of the parish, his own physical exertion becoming the height of the community. As the dusk settled and the evening angelus signalled the end of the labour, the sound of the bell provided a sense of closure to the day. It was a reaffirmation of the boundary between the work of the living and the stillness of the night. Even when the villagers were tucked into their hearths, mile away from the stone tower, the memory of that last ring lingered in the air, a final tether that bound them together against the encroaching silence. In the vast, uncaring landscape of the medieval countryside, the village did not just exist in space, it existed in time, and it was the bell that measured, protected, and defined that time, ensuring that through every season of hunger and harvest, the people remained connected by the resonance of their shared centre. In the dim light of the wattle and daub cottage, the material possessions of a medieval family held a weight that far exceeded their utilitarian purpose. In a society where ownership was tenuous, a heavy iron pot, a carved wooden chest, or a rough, hewn loom was not just a tool, it was a repository of lineage. These were the mnemonic anchors, objects that anchored the family to the soil and to the memory of those who had worked it before them. A cooking pot stained by 1,000 fires and notched by years of use was perhaps the most sacred object in the home. It had been carried through the famine of a grandmother's time, mended with scrap metal during a war, and passed down as the primary dowry of a daughter. Each dent told a story of survival. Each blackened layer of soot was a timeline of winters endured. When a young couple set up their own hearth, they were not just inheriting a utensil, they were inheriting the collective resilience of their ancestors. To own such an object was to participate in an unbroken chain of existence. This culture of inherited utility meant that nothing was ever truly discarded. A broken chest was stripped its iron hinges, which were then used to secure a new gate. The wood was recycled into stool or a warming board. This constant repurposing created a material history where the past was physically embedded in the present. The cottage walls, patched with clay from the same local pit for generations, held the scent and the spirit of the family's long history. The space became a living archive where every corner contained a fragment of ancestral labour. There was also a profound sense of stewardship attached to these items. The family felt a duty to keep the lineage of objects intact, for to lose them was to lose a part of their identity. In a world where the records of kings and barons were kept on parchment, the records of the common people were kept in the grain of a table, the texture of a hand, woven blanket, and the wear on a whetstone. These items served as the visual and tactile proof of their presence on the earth. As the hearth fire flickered, casting long shadows across the room, these objects seemed to glow with a life of their own. They were the silent witness to the laughter of children, the whispers of lovers, and the quiet grief of the elderly. They bridged the gap between the individual and the infinite, reminding every villager that they were not merely passing through a brief life, but were part of a larger material continuum. By carefully maintaining these humble artifacts, the people were forming an act of historical preservation, ensuring that even if their names were never recorded in the annals of the realm, their struggle, their craftsmanship, and their endurance would be etched into the fabric of the very things they left behind for the next generation. While history often records the grand clashes of knights and kings, the true battlefield of the Middle Ages was the furrow itself. The medieval peasant existed within a rigid system of tithes, labour duties, and manorial dues, yet they possessed a weapon of immense power, the subtle, calculated art of foot dragging. They understood that the Lord's wealth was entirely pendant on their hands, and this realization created a silent, ongoing negotiation of power that played out in the daily pace of work. When the bailiff arrived to demand the tilling of the demesne land, the Lord's personal fields, the pace of the village would shift. It was never a direct refusal which would be met with swift, brutal punishment. Instead, it was a collective slowing of the clock. Every task was performed with meticulous, exaggerated care. A hedge was trimmed so slowly that it seemed an act of profound devotion, even as the labourers communicated through glances that they were losing the harvest time on their own plots. This weapon of the weak was a sophisticated strategy of attrition. By controlling the speed of labour, they reclaimed a portion of their time and redirect their best energy back to their own gardens and common lands. This resistance extended to the hidden economy. Goods were bartered in the twilight, away from the watchful eyes of the manor's stewards. If a villager had a surplus of grain, it was often tucked away, forgotten in the threshing, or shared among neighbours in a way that left no paper trail for the tax collectors. They maintained a dual life, one that satisfied the formal external requirements of the manor, and a private, internal one that prioritized the survival of the kin group. This required a high level of communal discipline. To be an informer was to break the social contract of the village, and the cost of such betrayal was social ostracization. They also mastered the art of the plausible excuse. If a field was poorly ploughed, or a crop yield was lower than expected, the reason was always found in the inscrutable will of nature, the quality of the soil, the persistence of the rain, or the misfortune of a broken tool. By blaming the land, they effectively shielded them from the charge of sabotage. It was a dance of ambiguity, where both the lord and the peasant knew the truth, but both found it prudent to maintain the charade. The lord received enough to keep his power, and the peasant retained enough to endure the winter. This subtle resistance was not about overthrowing the order of the world. It was about carving out a space for human dignity within that order. It fostered a deep shared sense of identity among the villagers, a secret knowledge that they were the masters of their own persistence. Every bushel hidden, every hour reclaimed, and every shared resource kept away from the coffers of the manor was a silent victory. It was the resilience of the common man, proving that even in a world where every inch of earth had a lord, the spirit of those who worked the earth remained, in its own quiet, determined way, sovereign and free. In the medieval village, child was not a separate, sheltered realm, but an apprenticeship in the art of living. There were no classrooms, no formal curriculum, and no graduation. Instead, the young were constantly integrated in the adult world, learning by observation, mimicry, and the slow, steady assumption of responsibility. To be a child in the 4th century countryside was to be a junior partner in the grand project of collective survival. By the age of 7 or 8, a child was no longer a mere spectator, they were vital contributors. A girl would begin by gathering kindling, learning to recognize which wood burned clean and which produced too much smoke, a task that taught her the basic botany of the forest edge. A boy would be tasked with the humblest duties of the harvest, learning to respect the weight of the grain and the relentless pace of the threshing floor. These were not just chores, they were sensory lessons. They learned the texture of the soil, the changing smell of the air before a storm, and the complex social etiquette of the village moot. This was a pedagogy of the senses, ensuring that the knowledge of the ancestors was physically embedded in the next generation. Crucially, this education was inseparable from the concepts of duty. They saw their parents negotiate with the Lord's bailiff, watch them handle sickness with herbs, and observe the hushed, respectful rituals of the hearth. They learned that the individual was a link in a chain, that their labour was not for them alone, but for the resilience of the hearth, the kinship group, and the parish. This fostered a deep instinctual sense of communal identity. They did not need to be taught to value the group. They witnessed it every day in the shared harvest and the mutual support during the harsh winters. The most profound part of this hidden curriculum was the transmission of the oral archive. As they worked alongside the elders in the fields, they listened. They heard the stories of the village, the warnings about the local geography, and the moral tales that defined their culture. By the time they reached adulthood, their minds were filled with a vast, invisible library of precedents. They knew which fields were prone to waterlogging, whose families could be relied upon in a crisis, and how to read the landscape like a map of the past. As the years passed, this process was so seamless that the transition to adulthood was often marked by little more than the weight of a new responsibility, the day a son took over the heavy plough, or a daughter became the primary steward of the herb garden. They were the new guardians of the torch. This cycle ensured that even in the face of plague, famine, or war, the core wisdom of the village remained intact. They were not merely reproducing their society, they were refining it, carrying forward a legacy that had survived centuries of cold and shadow. It was a testament to the power of continuity, a quiet, enduring commitment to ensuring that the flicker of the hearth fire would never be extinguished, no matter how cold the world outside became. While the village hearth was the centre of social order, the true stability of the parish relied on those who lived at its periphery. These edge walkers, the solitary shepherds, the charcoal burners in the deep woods, or the families dwell in the remote shacks on the moorland, were the unsung sentinels of the medieval landscape. They occupied a space that was simultaneously lonely and vital, living in a constant tactile proximity to the forces that the main village only encountered in rumours or during the worst of times. The shepherd, for instance, spent weeks, sometimes months, in complete isolation with his flock. His world was defined by the movement of the clouds, the state of the forage, and the behaviour of predators. He was the village eyes in the wilderness. When he returned to the settlement, his presence was not just that of a trader or labourer, he was a bringer of news. He knew which wolves had been seen near the northern ridge, how the spring thaw was affecting the high pastures, and whether there was any sign of unusual movement along the forest tracks. He lived a life of deliberate solitude, yet his work was for the benefit of the collective safety. These edge dwellers developed a distinct psychological fortitude. Living outside the immediate protection of the village walls or the tight, night clusters of the cottages, they had to rely on a hyper-vigilance that the villagers closer to the church rarely needed. They knew the rhythm of the silence, a strange, deep quiet that signalled the arrival of a predator or the shifting of an atmospheric front. Their ears were tuned to the snapping of a twig, the flight of a startled bird, or the change in the direction of the wind before a storm. They were the human equivalent of a sensory outpost. Their very survival depended on their ability to interpret the minute, often imperceptible, signals of the natural world. There was also a cultural isolation that came with this role. They were often viewed with a mix of respect and unease by the villagers, men and women who had grown wild in the service of the village. They held a unique position in the social fabric. They were part of the community, yet they exist in a liminal space between the known order of the village and the untamed chaos of the wild. This marginalization was in itself a protective mechanism. It kept them free from the petty politics and the rigid hierarchies of the manor, allowing them a form of autonomy that the ordinary ploughman could never claim. As the dusk fell and the edge, Walker sat by a small hidden fire, watching the stars wheel overhead. They were the bridge between the human world and the infinite. They were the ones who ensured that when the villagers woke to the morning light, they did so in a world that had been scanned, watched, and mediated by someone who had spent the night in the shadows. They were the silent, invisible guardians of the perimeter. Without them, the village would have been far more vulnerable to the sudden, unpredictable shocks of the wild. Their life was a testament to the fact that the resilience of the community was not just built in the centre, but also maintained at the very margins by those willing to walk the edge where the light of the hearth fades in the mystery of the dark. In the medieval village, where the written word was the exclusive domain of the clergy and the literate elite, the most authoritative legal documents were not parchment rolls, they were the memories of the village elders. When a dispute arose over the exact placement of a boundary stone, a claim to a specific grazing right, or the lineage of a family standing, it was not to a court of law that the community turned, but to the living ledger, the oldest members of the parish. These elders were the human archives of the community. Their minds were etched with a precise topography of the landscape that existed long before the current inhabitant arrived. They recall with startling clarity the great flood of 40 years ago, the exact location where a boundary marker had been moved by a greedy landlord, or the specific custom that dictated how a harvest should be shared after a year of blight. When they spoke, they did so with an authority that was rarely challenged, for their memory was considered a sacred, communal asset. Their role as arbiters was a delicate, vital art. They did not just repeat facts, they wove context. An elder might settle a dispute by saying, "The boundary stone lies 3 paces from the bent oak where my father saw the winter wolves take the miller's calf." By anchoring the claim in a shared, they made the decision not just legally binding, but socially acceptable. They transformed dry legalism into narrative of community survival. To ignore their counsel was not just to break a law, it was to sever the connection to the collective identity that held the village together against the harshness of existence. This reliance on oral memory fostered a profound respect for old age. An elder was not a burden in the medieval village. They were the essential repository of wisdom, the indispensable librarians of the illiterate. Their presence was a stabilizing force, a reminder that the current struggle, no matter how intense, was merely a chapter in a much longer, enduring story. They taught the youth that time was not a straight line of linear progress, but a series of recurring cycles, and that the mistakes of the past were the primary guardrails against the disasters of the future. As the sun set, these elders would often sit by the church wall or in the warmest corner of the tavern, surrounded by a younger generation eager to drink in the history of their own land. In these moments, the boundary between the past and the present dissolved. The stories they told of forgotten harvests, ancient feuds, and the quiet heroism of ancestors were the mortar that held the village walls together. They were the keepers of the torch, ensuring that even in a world without records, the truth of their existence, their labour, and their resilience would never truly be lost. They were the final quiet sentinels of the village's sovereignty, proving that memory, when shared, is the most powerful technology of endurance. In the medieval village, the cemetery was not a place of haunting, but a place of homecoming. For the common folk who lived their entire lives in intimate, grueling contact with the earth, death was not a departure from the landscape, but a final, permanent integration into it. Most graves were unmarked or marked only by a simple mound of earth, which would eventually latten and be reclaimed by the grass and the wild flowers. This anonymity was not a sign of disrespect, but a reflection of a life lived in service to the collective. The villagers viewed the ground beneath their feet as a sacred, layered record. They understood that the soil was rich with the decomposition of countless generations, a literal ancestral foundation that fueled the next year's harvest. There was no dissonance in the idea that the field which fed their children was the same field that cradled their grandparents. This cycle of life and death was perceived as a singular, unbroken motion. The dead were not gone, they were merely resting in the same earth that required constant tending, and in return, the earth nurtured the living. For bereaved, the act of grief was deeply tied to the rhythm of the seasons. There were no elaborate funeral processions for the peasant. The body was wrapped in linen and committed to the ground with the same stoic efficiency that defined the harvest or the spring planting. However, the emotional weight of this act was immense. The graveyard, typically located in the shadow of the church, served as the village's spiritual anchor. It was the place where the vertical hierarchy of the feudal world, the lord in his manor, the priest in the chancel, was levelled by the universal, horizontal truth of the soil. This lack of permanent monuments fostered a unique relationship with history. Because they could not look to inscriptions on stone to remember the dead, they relied on the oral archive, the stories told around the hearths. A name might fade from the memory of the living after 3 or 4 generations, but the act of living remained. The fields they ploughed, the paths they walked, and the traditions they practiced were the true monuments. They were buried in the fabric of the community itself, existing as a silent collective presence that influenced the behaviour and survival strategies of their descendants. As a villager worked the soil, they were often aware that they were walking over the dust of those who had faced the same winters, the same hunger, and the same joy. This shared ground created a sense of solidarity that transcended time. It was a reminder that their own struggle was ephemeral, yet essential to the continuity of the village. The quiet, nameless graves were not symbols of insignificance. They were the quiet foundation of an entire civilization. They lived on in the strength of the community, in the wisdom passed down in songs, and in the resilience that allowed their children to keep turning the earth, season after season, under the watchful, eternal stars. The blacksmith's shop was the village unofficial research laboratory. While the rest of the world looked to the heavens for divine intervention, the smith looked in the heart of the forge, engaged in a perpetual empirical experiment with fire, iron, and carbon. Over the centuries, the village smith had become a master of material science, though he would never have used such a term. He understood the temper of steel, that delicate, dangerous window where iron transformed from a brittle lump into a tool that could hold an edge against the stubborn, stone-filled clay of the fields. This was a quiet revolution. As the smiths refined their techniques, they began to introduce small incremental changes to their tools. A ploughshare was reshaped to reduce friction. An axe head was balanced more perfectly to save the user's energy. A scythe was tempered to retain its sharpness through a long morning's harvest. These were not just minor adjustments. They were the technological foundations of an era of growth. By increasing the efficiency of every tool, the smith was, in effect, expanding the caloric surplus of the entire village. A more efficient harvest meant more grain in the bins, which meant more survival during the harsh, lean months of winter. The knowledge of these techniques was guarded like holy scripture. A smith's reputation depended on his ability to read the fire. He knew that the colour of the glowing metal, from the dull cherry red of a slow heat to the blinding star, like white of a welding heat, told him exactly when to strike. This rhythmic sensory dialogue with the furnace was the bedrock of rural progress. It was a skill passed down from master to apprentice through the rhythm of the hammer, an unbroken chain of technical knowledge that had persisted since the dawn of the Iron Age. Moreover, the smith's role was social as much as it was technical. He was the one who could interpret the changing demands of the land. When the village shifted from planting wheat to raising more sheep, the smith would alter the design of the shears and the branding irons. He was the architect of the village transition. His anvil was the place where the needs of the field met the possibilities of the metal. In this way, the blacksmith acted as a conduit for change, introducing new methods of construction that slowly, steadily eased the physical burden of the peasantry. As the sparks flew in the darkness of the workshop, they mirrored the slow, brilliant sparks of innovation that were illuminating the medieval landscape. These changes were rarely sudden. They were the accumulation of 1,000 strikes, 1,000 temperings, and 1,000 failures. Yet cumulatively, they represent a profound mastery of the physical world. The villagers were no longer just struggling against the environment. They were beginning to shape it. Through the skill of their smith, they were turning the raw, indifferent iron of the earth into a partner in their survival, creating a legacy of tools that would outlive them and carry their industry into the next generation. When the harvest was finally stored, and the threat of the coming winter was held at bay for just a moment, the medieval village broke its rhythm of endurance. The harvest festival was not merely a celebration, it was a necessary choreography of excess. After months of austerity, where every movement was calculated for efficiency and every scrap of food was accounted for, the village allowed itself a brief, explosive release. This was the moment where the social hierarchy, so rigid and demanding during the working year, was temporarily suspended in favour of a shared, communal delirium. The dances that unfolded on the village green were more than steps, they were rhythmic assertions of life. In a world where the body was often broken by the plough and the heavy load, the dance reclaimed the body for joy. The music, driven by the frantic pace of the pipe and the steady thrum of the drum, forced a synchronization of hearts and movements. For those few hours, the individual ceased to be a subject of the manor or a servant of the soil. They were a singular, pulsing entity. This ritual was vital for the psychological health of the community, acting as a pressure valve for the suppressed grievances and exhaustion of the season. The feast that followed was a carefully curated act of defiance against scarcity. Resources that had been meticulously hoarded were brought to the common table. It was a demonstration of communal wealth, a declaration that, despite the tithes and the taxes, the village possessed enough to share. This collective consumption reinforced the ties of kinship and mutual aid. To eat together was to pledge loyalty to one another. It was a visceral reminder that their survival was not an individual effort, but a communal project. The act of breaking bread was the strongest social contract they knew. Even the superstitions that permeated the festival had a functional logic. The mock trials of a king of the harvest, and the inversion of roles where the youngest might lead the elders, were deeply symbolic. By symbolically overthrowing the order of the world, they acknowledged the absurdity and the weight of their own reality. It was a carnivalesque space where the frustrations of the peasant were aired through satire and play. This psychological inversion served to stabilize the social order by letting off steam through ritualized chaos. They ensured that the actual order would remain intact when the morning sun demanded a return to the fields. As the fires burned low and the music faded in the cool night air, a profound sense of unity remained. They had navigated another cycle, conquered the uncertainty of the weather, and fulfilled the demands of the seasons. The festivum provided the emotional fuel needed to face the impending darkness of winter. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a refusal to be defined solely by toil and survival. In the dance, the feast, and the shared laughter, they found the dignity that the heavy hand of feudal law could never touch. They were, for a brief moment, the masters of their own existence, writing their own joy on the face of the earth. Beyond the manicured boundaries of the arable fields lay the untamed, the dense, sprawling woodlands that served as the dark height of the medieval landscape. To the uninitiated, the forest was a chaotic void of shadow and threat, but to the villager, the woodland possessed a sophisticated, legible syntax. It was a secondary ledger of life, as essential to their survival as the plough, land, and it required a different kind of fluency, a vernacular of the senses. The forest communicated through a series of subtle cascading signals. A sudden silence among the birds was not an absence of sound, It was an alarm, a linguistic trigger warning of a predator or a stranger moving through the canopy. The way the light filtered through the canopy, dappled, shifting, and precise, told the hunter or the gatherer exactly how much time remained before the evening descent. The texture of the moss on a trunk, the precise angle of a fallen branch, the lingering scent of damp. Loam after a rain, each was a word in a complex, ongoing sentence about the state of the wilderness. Learning this language was an essential part of the rural education. A child learned that the forest was never truly silent. It was a living, breathing tapestry of interkentic signals. To enter the woods was to engage in a dialogue where the human was the junior partner, the observer who must learn to listen before tempting to take. They gathered firewood, pottage for their pigs, and medicinal bark not by conquering the wood, but by reading it, understanding the cycles of growth, decay, and regeneration that govern the understory. This deep, intuitive understanding of the wild provided a psychological anchor. When the political world of the manor became too oppressive, the forest offered a space that belonged to no lord and followed no feudal decree. It was a realm of older, deeper laws. The villagers felt a profound sense of territorial belonging to these woods, regarding them as a shared resource that, while dangerous, was fundamentally theirs. They knew the secret clearings, the hidden springs, and the trails that bypassed the king's official paths. As the sun deepened in the gold of late afternoon, the forest became a sanctuary of reflection. The villagers would move through the shadows with a practiced, light-footed grace, their presence almost imperceptible to the local fauna. They were not intruders, they were participants in the woodland's ecology. This connection fostered a sense of humility, a recognition that their lives were but a brief passage in a landscape that had seen ages rise and fall. In the whisper of the leaves and the creak of the ancient boughs, they heard the echo of their own mortality, and in that echo they found a strange, grounding peace. They lived the wild not as a boundary, but as a vast, enduring companion, teaching them that even in the heart of the deepest shadow there was a rhythm, a purpose, and a home. In the rhythm of the medieval year, the most critical figure was often not the lord or the priest, but the steward of the stores. They were the keepers of the communal pantry, the granaries, the salted meat cellars, and the hidden caches of dried legumes. In a world where the margin between survival and starvation was thinner than a winter cloak, these individuals functioned as the ultimate arbiters of the village longevity. They were the ones who calculated the arithmetic of endurance, ensuring that every bushel was accounted for, and every ration was distributed with the cold, precise logic of survival. Their authority was silent but absolute. They managed the social balance of the village, ensuring that even the most vulnerable families received enough to survive the deep frost. This required a profound understanding of community dynamics. They knew exactly who had contributed the most to the harvest, and who might be hiding a small surplus for a rainy day. They were the masters of the ledger that exists only in their heads, tracking the flow of resource with a memory that was as reliable as any parchment record. These stewards practiced the art of the thin spread. They knew when to tighten the communal belt before a crisis hit, and when to release a small, morale, boosting portion of stored honey or fermented fruit to keep the village spirits from breaking during the darkest months. Their decision-making was governed by a philosophy of collective preservation. They understood that if one family fell to starvation, it weakened the entire structure of the village. Thus, their role was to balance the needs of the individual, the survival of the collective. In the damp, cool darkness of the storehouses, they worked with a reverence bordering on the sacred. Every grain sack was a lifeline, and every jar of fat was a testament to the labour of the summer. They were the guardians of the village future. Their presence was felt most acutely during the winter, when the outside world had turned hostile, and the only warmth was found in the shared resolve to make it to the spring thaw. Their silence and vigilance were the invisible walls, protecting the community from the slow, creeping approach of famine. As they sat by their modest fires, these stewards carried the heavy burden of knowing exactly how much time the village had left. They were the people who navigated the terrifying math of the lean years, constantly calculating, adjusting, and sacrificing. Their existence was a quiet, unheralded defiance of nature's indifference. Without their stewardship, the resilience of the community would have shattered under the weight of the winter. They were the architects of continuity, ensuring that when the first green shoot pushed through the melting snow of March, there would be a people still standing, ready to start the cycle all over again. When the low-ceilinged rooms of the medieval cottage, the rhythmic thrum-clack of the hand-loom was the secondary height of the village. Weaving was more than a technical craft, it was a meditative act of social cohesion. The weaver, often sitting in the dim light for hours, did not just create fabric, they were interweaving the fibres of the community's shared life into durable, protective reality. Each thread spun from the wool of local sheep or the flax from the village field represent a strand of labour, sweat, and collective necessity. This process was deeply communal. The full a single thread could be woven, the village had to cooperate, shearing the sheep, scouring the grease from the wool, carding it, and spinning it into yarn. It was a long, interdependent sequence where the failure of one person meant the exhaustion of others. The weaver was the one who pulled these individual efforts into a final, tangible whole. When a villager donned a tunic, they were wearing the visible result of their neighbour's labour. This made every garment a symbol of the social fabric, a constant, tactile reminder that they were held together by the efforts of those around them. The weaver's technical knowledge was a form of silent wisdom. They understood the tension of the warp and the agility of the weft, know exactly how much strain a fibre could take before it snapped. This was a profound lesson in rural governance. If the tension was too tight, the fabric would tear. If it was too loose, it would offer no warmth. They understood that the strength of the cloth came not from any single thread, but from the tight, reciprocal binding of all threads working in unison. This philosophy permeated the village approach to disputes and crises. They knew that a community, like a garment, was only as strong as its tightest knot. Furthermore, the loom was a repository of stories. As the shuttle flew back and forth, the weaver would often sing, recite local legends, or listen to the news of the parish. The fabric itself became imbued with the atmosphere of these moments. A blanket woven during a winter famine felt different to the touch, more tightly packed, more desperate in its density than one made during the light-hearted bustle of the harvest. The textile was a material record of their history, a tactile archive that kept the warmth of the past against the skin of the living. As the dusk gathered and the weaver finally released the tension on the loom, there was a sense of profound completion. They had taken raw, chaotic fibres and turned them into order, warmth, and protection. This was the quintessence of the medieval spirit, the constant, quiet act of transforming the raw indifference of the world into something useful, something beautiful, and something that ensured the survival of the kin group. The woven cloth was their shield against the biting winds, but more than that, it was their banner, a testament to the fact that through every struggle they remained bound together, unyielding and resilient, in the tapestry of their own making. In the medieval village, the most influential figure was often not the one with the loudest voice, but the one who could best read the silent language of the clouds. These sky readers were individuals, often the old-age shepherds or the most experienced harvesters, whose lives had been spent in such deep dialogue with the environment that they possessed an almost instinctual grasp of the coming weather. They were the unofficial navigators of the village fate, holding a knowledge that was passed down like a sacred invisible map of the heavens. Their expertise was a masterclass in empirical observation. They didn't rely on instruments. They relied on the subtle, cascading patterns of the physical world. The way a spider reinforced its web against the impending humidity, the specific weight of the air before a thunderstorm, the colour of the sunset filtering through high-altitude ice crystals, or the peculiar restlessness of cattle before a gale, all were decipherable sentences in a grand atmospheric scroll. When the village faced the decision of whether to cut the hay or let it ripen for one more jay, they turned to these observers, whose advice could determine the difference between a winter of abundance and a winter of hollow bellies. This knowledge served as a crucial defence mechanism by anticipating the arrival of a torrential flood or a frost that could wipe out the orchard. They could mobilise the community to take protective measures, covering the hives, driving the livestock to higher ground, or shoring up the drainage ditches around the grain stores. It was a form of proactive resilience. In a world where a week of unseasonal rain could mean the collapse of the year's labour, the sky reader was the one who brought the community the gift of time. This role also had a deeply psychological function. By naming the rain and identifying the seasons of danger, they turned the terrifying, unpredictable chaos of nature into a manageable set of risks. They transformed the fear of the unknown into a preparation for the known. This provided the village with a sense of agency. Even if they could not control the climate, they could position themselves within it. It reinforced the communal bond, as everyone leaned on the experience of the individual to ensure the safety of the whole. As the sky reader stood on the ridge, watching the dark, bruised clouds gather on the horizon, they were the bridge between the human struggle and the vast, indifferent mechanics of the planet. They were the ones who ensured that the community was never caught completely unawares. Their existence was a testament to the power of long-term observation and the profound human capacity to adapt. They stood as the silent, steady sentinels of the seasons, ensuring that no matter how harsh the elements became, the village would remain anchored by the knowledge of those who had learned to read the sky as if it were the face of a friend. Modern life is defined by the acceleration of time, but the medieval villager lived by a tempo that was fundamentally glacial. This was the architecture of waiting, a profound, disciplined patience that was not passive, but an active form of engagement with the world. To be a farmer was to know that no amount of human anxiety could force a seed to sprout faster, and no amount of desperation could stop the rain from rotting the wheat. This relation forced a transmission, the cultivation of a steady, unwavering internal rhythm that mirrored the slow, cyclical motion of the earth. This patience was a survival strategy. In the deep winter, when the storehouses were thinning and the cold seemed eternal, panic was the greatest threat. The villagers knew that the only way to endure was to slow down, to conserve energy, to occupy the hands with small, repetitive tasks like whittling or spinning, and to keep the mind focused on the eventual return of the sun. They practiced temporal endurance, a way of compartmentalizing the present suffering as a temporary state that would inevitably yield to the future. Their patience was also a manifestation of humility. It was an acknowledgement that they were not the authors of the timeline, but merely the inhabitants of it. They learned to accept the inscrutable will of the seasons without the resentment that stems from modern expectations of control. If a crop failed, they did not waste energy on frantic, short-sighted reactions. They observed the failure, learned the lesson the soil offered, and redirected their focus to the next cycle. This was not resignation, it was the quiet, strategic wisdom of the long-term survivor. The social structure of the village reinforced this patience. Decisions were rarely made in haste. Before a community project was undertaken, like clearing a new plot of woodland or repairing the parish bridge, there were long periods of deliberation. The elders, the village leaders, and the heads of families would weigh the costs and benefits over many evenings. This communal slowness ensured that actions were well considered and supported by the collective. It was a societal guardrail against the destructive impulse of individual ego. As a villager sat by the hearth, watching the embers pulse with a slow, fading heat, they embodied this ancient patience. They knew that their life was a mosaic of 1,000 small, slow actions. By mastering the art of waiting, they found a form of freedom that the powerful could never seize. The freedom from the frantic, unstained pace of the world. They lived in the deep, resonant time of the earth, where every season, every hardship, and every joy had its appointed hour. It was a life lived in accordance with a much larger clock, proving that the most enduring power often belongs, not to the one who moves the fastest, but to the one who knows how to hold their ground and wait for the spring. In the medieval landscape, there were no paved roads, only the living maps, the narrow, beaten footpaths that snaked through the fields, carved into the earth by the relentless tread of generations. These trails were the true cartography of the village. They did not follow the geometry of power or the straight lines of the surveyor. They followed the logic of necessity, human endurance, and the geography of the landscape itself. To walk these paths was to walk through the history of the community. Each path had a specific function of survival. There was the path to the well, smooth and slick with the morning damp, the path to the woods, marked by the scattering of stray twigs and autumn leaves, and the sacred narrow trail that led to the church, kept clearer than the others as a sign of communal duty. These were not just lines on the ground, they the arteries of the village. They dictated how the people moved, how they gathered, and how they maintained their connection to one another. Over centuries, these trails became so deeply etched into the soil that they became permanent features of the landscape, defying even the plough. The act of walking these paths was a form of collective orientation. A child learned the layout of the world by following their parents' footsteps. They learned that too. Step off the path was to risk losing one's way or, in the darker corners of the wild, to risk danger. The trails provide a sense of security, a thread of certainty in a world that was oft overwhelming in its vastness. They were the physical manifestation of the village's social order, a quiet agreement on how to navigate the space they shared. Moreover, these paths were the primary medium of social transmission. It was on these trails that the real work of the village was negotiated. A conversation held on the way to the stream could decide the fate of a grazing plot or the reconciliation of a family feud. The rhythm of the walk matched the rhythm of the life they lived, deliberate, persistent, and grounded. Because they travelled these paths every day, the villagers developed an intimate, almost tactile relationship with the earth. They knew every incline, every patch of mud, and every change in the texture of the soil. They didn't just use the landscape, they felt it through their feet. As the sun began to dip, casting long dramatic shadows across the furrows, the trails seemed to glow with a life of their own. They were the veins of the earth, pulsing with the silent history of all who had walked them before. In the persistence of these paths, the village found its greatest strength. It was a reminder that while empires might rise and fall, and lords might claim dominion over the land, the people would always find their way home. They would always follow the same ancient trails, etched by the persistence of their ancestors, carrying the weight of their own survival into the twilight, one measured step at a time. In the medieval village, the setting of the sun did not signal the end of existence. It signalled the transition into the theatre of the hearth. As the world outside became a tapestry of indistinct shadows and potential threats, the cottage became an island of concentrated light and humanity. The fire was the absolute centre of this microcosm, the sole source of heat illumination, and the focal point for the preservation of culture. Everything after dusk revolved around the rhythmic pulsing of the flames. The night was when the oral library was opened. Without the distraction of labour, the village's collective consciously merged. Elders would recount tales that were not merely for entertainment, they were the moral framework of the community. They spoke of the origins of the village, the virtues of the ancestors, and the warnings embedded in local folklore. Through the medium of storytelling, the complex lessons of survival were simplified into parables. A child learned not just how to work the land, but how to act within it, understanding the consequences of greed, the value of communal trust, and the necessity of humility before the forces of nature. This was also the time for the quiet labour of the home. By the flickering light, fingers remained busy. Mending, carving, spinning and sorting, the work never fully stopped, but its character changed. It became a slower, more intentional process, accompanied by the low hum of conversation. The night brought a softening of the social hierarchies that defined the daylight hours. With the family unit, the barriers were lower, and the intimate connections of kinship were forged and reinforced. It was a space of reflection where the day's exhaustion was washed away by the warmth of the fire and the presence of those who shared the same fate. For the medieval mind, the night was also a threshold, a boundary between the physical world of the village and the metaphysical world of the unknown. The darkness outside was alive with spirits, omens, and the mysteries of the wild. This perceived danger made the safety of the hearth even more profound. The act of gathering round the fire was a ritual of exclusion. It was a way of saying, "Here, within this circle, we are one." It turned the cottage into a sanctuary, a fortified space where the community's identity was protected from the dissolving influence of the dark. As the embers finally began to die down, and the conversation faded to the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping family, the hearth fire was carefully banked, covered with ash to hold the heat until morning. This was the most important ritual of the day. To keep the spark alive was to ensure the continuity of the next day's cycle. They slept with the quiet confidence that, regardless of how deep the night or how cold the wind, they had done their part to preserve the flame. They were the architects of their own endurance, proving that even in the vast, indifferent darkness of the world, a single hearth could sustain a people, a memory, and a hope. If one were to slice through the soil of a medieval village, they would not find the gold or grand monuments of kings, but the stratigraphy of the mundane. Every layer of earth is a silent archive of daily life, a shard of crude pottery used for cooking pottage, a broken spindle wall lost in the rushes of a floor, an iron nail pulled from a collapsed fence. These were the debris of an existence that left no chronicles, yet they hold the most authentic history of the Middle Ages. They are the artifacts of a persistence that defined the era. Each object tells a story of intense necessity. A piece of blackened clay, once part of a pot, speaks of a mother's daily struggle to feed her children in a year of poor harvest. A rusted iron hook reveals the ingenuity of a villager who found a way to secure a tool that they could not afford to replace. These are not merely trash. They are the physical evidence of lives lived in direct, unmediated contact with the environment. They show us how the villagers modified their world, bit by bit, through the refinement of their tools and the constant addition of their material culture. The most poignant aspect of this archaeology of the everyday is the evidence of communal repair. The villagers did not discard things easily, they mended. A cracked bowl would be bound with wire. A worn-out cloak would be patched until the original fabric was all but gone. This culture of perpetual maintenance was a survival imperative. Nothing was truly ephemeral. Everything had a life cycle that was extended through the diligence of the user. This practice reflects a worldview where resources were finite and the labour required to replace them was immense. These fragments also reveal the intimacy of the domestic. In the compact space of the cottage, every object had a place and a purpose, creating a highly organised, dense environment. When we find the scattered remnants of a meal, the bones of a pig, the seeds of wild berries, the charred remains of rye, we are looking at the geography of the hearth. We see how the community gathered, what they valued, and how they mediate their relationship with the natural world. They were not just surviving, they were curating a home, a sanctuary of order against the encroaching entropy of the wilderness. As we examine these mute witnesses to history, we realize that the true power of the medieval village was not in its structure or its governance, but in the accumulated wisdom of its people, a wisdom embedded in every tool they touched and every object they cared for. They were the masters of making much out of little. Their legacy is not etched in stone, but in the very soil they cultivated, a thin, precious layer of human history that remains beneath our feet, whispering of a time when the strength of society was measured not by its monuments, but by the resilience of the humble, broken things that bound a people together, generation after generation. While the village was a sanctuary of stability, it was never a closed loop. The pulse of the outside world reached the hearth through the nomadic pulse, the wandering peddlers, seasonal labourers, and messengers, who navigated the precarious tracks between parishes. These figures were the vital arteries of the medieval landscape, carrying more than just goods. They were the carriers of information, genetic diversity, and the collective memory of the wider region. The arrival of a traveller was an event of intense communal focus. They brought news of the Lord's latest decree, rumours of plague in the next valley, or reports of a good harvest to the north. In a world defined by the horizon of one's own field, these outsiders were the map, makers of the imagination. They provided the necessary context to the villagers' existence, remind them that they were part of a larger kingdom, a wider church, and a broader human experience. Their stories could change the mood of an entire village, sparking hope or instilling caution. These travellers also act as informal agents of technological and cultural diffusion. A peddler might carry a new kind of sickle blade from a distant forge, or an improved method for curing hides, or a song from a different county. They were the accidental innovators, introducing tiny variations into the village-established routines. Over time, these small influences accumulated, causing the village culture to slowly evolve without the villagers ever realizing they were changing. It was a gradual, organic process of cross-pollination that kept the rural traditions from stagnating. For the villagers, the traveller was a paradox, an object of suspicion and a vessel of wonder. They were welcomed with bread and fire, yet kept at a distance, for they represented the unknown. This tension was essential. It kept the community alert, balancing their deep attachment to their own land with a necessary awareness of the world outside. The interaction was often transactional, but it carried a deeper, symbolic weight. It was the act of extending a hand in the dark, connecting the known home to the vast, mysterious periphery. As the traveller left at dawn, slipping back into the mist that cloaked the forest paths, they left behind a village that was slightly different than it had been the night before. A piece of information had been shared, a new rhythm of a song had been learned, or a new tool had been bartered. These travellers were the unseen threads binding the archipelago of villages together, ensuring that even in their solitude, the people were never truly alone. They were the architects of a broader, connected identity, proving that the strength of the village did not just come from within, but from its ability to remain open to the currents of the world, one muddy path at a time. In the medieval village, time was not measured by the turning of hands on a clock face. It was measured by the resonance of the church bell. This sonic grid was the absolute regulator of communal existence. The tolling of the bell was a language that every villager understood instinctively, a complex code that translated the infinite, flowing nature of time into the concrete, manageable segments of labour and prayer. The bell did not just call the faithful to church, it synchronized the entire village to a single shared frequency. When the bell rang for matins, at the first hint of grey light, it signalled the dissolution of the dream state and beginning of the day's obligations. A different cadence marked the midday meal, providing a mandatory pause that allowed the community to catch its breath and gather its strength. The evening toll, the curfew, carried a more solemn weight, signalling the end of the workday and the transition from the public, outward-facing life of the fields to the private, inward-facing life of the hearth. For a people whose lives were physically exhausting, these auditory landmarks provided a sense of structure that prevented the day from becoming an endless, demoralizing slog. This auditory infrastructure was crucial for social coordination. In a landscape where houses were scattered, and the forest obscured the horizon, the sound of the bell was the only way to send a unified signal across the parish. If a fire broke out, a rapid, frantic clanging created an immediate visceral alert that superseded all individual concerns. If a death occurred, the slow, rhythmic tolling notified every neighbour that the cycle of a life had concluded. It was the medium through which the village functioned as a singular, responsive organism. The bell also acted as a psychological tether. To hear the familiar tone, a sound that had been ringing in that exact valley for hundreds of years, was to be reminded of one's place with a long, continuous history. It was a comforting, omnipresent voice that claimed the village as a territory of order. The sound travelled across the fields, over the woods, and into the homes, creating an invisible dome of community identity. No matter how far a ploughman wandered into the farthest acre, the bell would find him, pulling his focus back to the centre, back to the collective, back to the shared purpose of the parish. As the sun sank low and the final deep peal of the curfew bell vibrated through the crisp evening air, the villagers would stop their work and look toward the steeple. It was a moment of profound alignment. The sound was a reminder that they were not solitary units struggle against the wild, but a linked, coordinated body. The bell was the pulse of the village, a height of iron and air that ensured that even in the most grueling years, the community would move as one, breathe as one, and remain, through the sound of its own calling, resiliently, undeniably alive. We have wandered through the fields of the medieval village, from the first light of the morning plough to the dying embers of the hearth, observing a world that was as harsh as it was resilient. We have seen how the village was not a primer-stage history, but a sophisticated masterpiece of survival, a tight-woven tapestry of memory, rhythm, and communal pacts. To look back at these people is not to look back at an age of darkness, but to witness the very moment humanity learned to master its environment through the power of collective endurance. Their legacy is not written in the gilded chronicles of the ruling class, but in the landscape itself. Every boundary, every path, every tradition that prioritized the survival of the group over the ambition of the individual was a deliberate act of creation. They built a society that functioned like a living forest, interconnected, responsive, and deeply rooted in the cycles of the earth. They proved that the most profound knowledge of survival is not the sword or the stone monument, but the quiet, persistent, and unshakable bond between neighbours. As we stand in the present, looking back at their lives, we see that we are the direct heirs to their resilience. The patience they practiced, the way they valued the collective, and the grace with which they accepted the limitations of their existence, these are the hidden foundations of our own world. We carry their legacy in our language, in our agricultural rhythms, and in the deep-seated human need for connection that still drives us today. They were the original architects of human stability, the ones who kept the flame of knowledge alive through centuries of uncertainty, ensuring that when the sun rose, there would always be someone left to turn the earth. So let us remember the villagers, the anonymous, the silent, and the steady. They were the ones who turned the raw, indifferent K into home, who found beauty in the labour of the day, and who understood, better than we ever might, that the true purpose of life is not to conquer the future, but to nurture the present. Their history is not a closed chapter. It is an enduring, pulsing rhythm that continues beneath the surface of our own lives. They were the keepers of the seed, the guardians of the fire, and the eternal weavers of the collective thread. As the history of the medieval village fades into the quiet expanse of the past, their voices remain, whispering in the wind that rustles through the fields. They remind us that no matter how much the world changes, the fundamental truths remain the same, that we are strong together, that our labour has meaning, and that in the simplest acts of kindness, memory, and persistence, we hold the power to shape the world. The harvest is stored, the fire is banked, and the story continues, carried by the footsteps of all those who came before, and all those who will walk these paths hereafter. Sleepy History with Kevin is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.